Dunn. I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak to the Walden University community today.
We're glad to have you here as well, Dr. Zin. Today you are presenting statistical tests for doctoral research. The statistical test process for research is a challenging one for many doctoral students. From your perspective, Dr. Zin, how best should students approach the statistical test process?
Well, Dr. Dunn, from my experience, I found a six-step process to approach statistics for doctoral research. The six-step process is 1. Determination of the research questions. 2. Operationalizing of the variables. 3. A determination of the appropriate test statistic to answer the research questions. 4. Sample size calculation using G-Power software. 5. The data collection process, whether a primary or secondary data collection process is chosen. Follow up with the statistical analysis using SPSS or another statistical software package. And 6, a posterior analysis of achieved power.
Well, Dr. Zin, that is a comprehensive approach. So I'd like to take this time now to go to our first poll, the one on the bottom left of the screen. And the question was, are you afraid of the statistical process for dissertation? Looks currently, Dr. Zin, like about 62% are saying yes, and 36 to 38. So roughly 2/3 of it are yes, and 1/3 is a no.
Hopefully we can change some of those numbers today.
Yeah, absolutely.
The research questions at the core of doctoral research. Many students have difficulty deciding on their research questions. I often suggest to students that the research question is in essence, what do you want to know?
So let's now look at poll number 2. So this poll is, are you undecided or unclear about your research question? Looks like about 1/3 are unclear and 2/3 are pretty clear, having no problems.
One thing I noticed is that a majority of students have their research questions already in mind, which is very positive.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Yeah, it looks like we're running 85 to 90% already have their research questions. So that's good. We have a good group here today.
That's good. Sometimes students have very broad research questions, and other times the research questions are very narrow and deep. Narrow and deep research questions are easier to work with. When the research questions are very broad, I suggest that students use this research question as the overarching research question for the study, and then select 3 to 5 narrow and specific research questions which can answer the overarching research question. Of course, students always need to work with their chair and committee members when crafting their research questions.
That is a very important point. Students need to work with their chair and committee members when crafting their research questions. Dr. Zin, can you give us an example of a very broad research question and another which you refer to as narrow and deep?
Certainly, Dr. Dunn. A real example of a very broad research question I was presented was, why are some women-owned businesses more successful in Zimbabwe?
This is a very broad research question and a very important topic. I can see that this question would be challenging to answer with a simple, straightforward data analysis. So again, let's look at our polls. So on the left, the question, are you familiar with operationalizing of variables? And here's a question I think all of us kind of face is, are you afraid of statistics? And right now, 42.8% of the voters are saying yes, while 56% are saying no. I think from my perspective, I think everybody's a little bit afraid of statistics. And, as you become more familiar and comfortable with it, then, it's going to get a little bit easier. You're going to get more comfortable and it won't be as fearful.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dr. Dunn. Getting back to our research question regarding women-owned businesses in Zimbabwe, to this student, I recommended, that she use this as the overarching research question for her study, and then to focus on individual research questions on specific measurable determinants related to business success in Zimbabwe.
Yep. That is a good approach, Dr. Zin. Can you give us an example of a research question that you refer to as narrow and deep?
Yes, certainly. A research question that is both, fun, narrow, and deep is, does the consumption of diet soda result in the same body mass effect as the consumption of regular soda?
Okay, so let's go back to our polls again and see if any of the results have changed based on what we've already learned. So the first question to the left, are you familiar with operationalizing of variables? And again, it looks like it's about 50-50 that are familiar with operation variables. And I guess on the question of are you afraid of statistics, it looks like it's around 40% saying yes and 60% saying no.
The focus here is that we make the assumption that diet soda consumption leads to a better body mass effect. We just want to know whether diet soda consumption has the same association to body mass as regular soda consumption.
So how do we answer our diet soda research question?
Well, Dr. Dunn, we begin by operationalizing the variables.
What do you mean by operationalizing the variables, Dr. Zin?
Operationalizing the variables is the conversion of the data to numerical values. Stats are all math. SPSS only recognizes numbers. However, the researcher collects data. The data needs to be operationalized into numerical values for the statistical software to analyze.
Okay, so we're going to go back to our polls now. Are you familiar with the types of variables? So I can see that many of you attended the earlier presentation on variable types. Let's hope so. But you're answering high on that. So 94 to 95% are saying yes, you're familiar with variable types. That's great. Now we're asked the second question, are you still afraid of statistics? Dr. Zin, the numbers have dropped a little bit. It looks like a third are saying yes and 2/3 are saying no to the question, are you afraid of statistics?
Yeah.
We do have a third.
Go right ahead, Dr. Dunn.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that's interesting. So hopefully we'll be able to reduce some of the fear of statistics.
Yeah, we got some room there for growth. That's good. Be easy to measure that. We do have another poll up. I do want to mention this question: are you familiar with continuous or ratio variables, and are you familiar with dichotomous variables? So again, it looks like the majority are saying yes, familiar with continuous or ratio variables, about 66%, so about 2/3. Looks like about a third are not familiar with continuous and ratio variables. About 28% are familiar with dichotomous variables, and about 31 to 34% are not familiar with dichotomous variables. So that's very interesting. Again, an area where we can really probably show some improvement. It is easy to recognize how to measure diet and soda consumption, but how do you measure body mass effect? Or better, how do you operationalize body mass effect, Dr. Zin?
Well, Dr. Dunn, body mass effect can be operationalized using a continuous variable, scale or ratio measures such as body mass index, or body mass effect can be operationalized into a dichotomous variable. The participant develops a high body mass index or does not develop a high body mass index. The cutoff point for body mass index or percentage adipose tissue needs to be supported with published literature. Even soda consumption can be operationalized into continuous or dichotomous. Dichotomous being diet soda or regular soda.
Okay, so let's go back to our polls again. So are you familiar with different data types? That number hasn't really moved a lot, but it looks like, most of the people are familiar with data types. So that's awesome. The question, are you still afraid of statistics? It looks still like we're around about a third. So I think it's getting better. I think when we started, it was around 50% or even higher. So even in the short presentation, I think we're making some improvements there.
That's good news. That's good news, Dr. Dunn.
So Dr. Zin, now that we have decided on how to operationalize variables in our diet soda study, where do we go next?
Well, Dr. Dunn, now that we've determined the operationalization of the variables, we can focus on the appropriate test statistics for our study.
Okay, so can you give us a couple of examples from our diet soda research study, Dr. Zin?
Certainly, Dr. Dunn. I often suggest to students to first consider the dependent variable or outcome variable before the independent or factor variables. For our diet soda research study, the dependent variable is body mass effect. If we decide to measure the participant's body mass effect as continuous or as a ratio, then we'll want to use a linear regression analysis. The linear regression analysis can be either simple or multiple, depending on the number of independent variables or factors we'll be considering. If we decide to measure the participant's body mass effect as a dichotomous variable, high body mass index or low body mass index, then we'll want to use a logistic regression analysis. And as before, the logistic regression analysis can be either simple or multiple, depending upon the number of independent variables or factors we will be considering.
All right. So again, let's go back to the polls. Still good results on poll number 1, identifying the variables. Are you still afraid of statistics? I see that number dropping. We're now, looks like a little bit under 30%. So we are making some good progress here, Dr. Zin. These are some good points you have discussed, Dr. Zin. What is our next step?
Our next step, Dr. Dunn, is to run a minimum sample size calculation using G-Power software.
Why is it that we do not run sample size calculations at the beginning of our research design process, especially since many students are trying to figure out the feasibility of their research based on the sample size?
Great question, Dr. Dunn. You bring forth a common occurrence and mistake by many student researchers. To successfully run accurate sample size calculations using G-Power software, the researcher needs to plug in the statistical test to be used before G-Power can crunch the mathematics. The statistical test can only be properly determined after a determination of the operationalization of the variables is made.
Okay, so we have a new set of polls. Looks the first one on the one on the middle. Let's start with that because I don't see any responses on question 5A. You know, if you're still answering the questions, you know, go ahead and put in what types of statistics you'll be using for your study. But on the middle poll, are you familiar with StatChat G-Power software tutorials that are available on YouTube? And right now, about 75% or no, a little bit, you know, around a quarter are saying yes. And I do want to put in a plug for you, Dr. Zin. So Dr. Zin has developed a series of stat chats, and they're on our YouTube channel. And they're just small, little educational episodes. And he's done a whole series on G-Power. And so if you're trying to figure out G-Power, step 1 is to download the software. Step 2 is to watch Dr. Zin's G-Power sessions.
Thank you for the plug, Dr. Dunn.
So I'm looking for, yeah, I don't see responses to the others, so I'm going to move on. That is informative, Dr. Zin. Let's see. What is our next step in conducting our diet soda research?
Well, Dr. Dunn, I believe you'll appreciate the next step of our research, data collection, or in our study, soda consumption. So.
I do like this next step, Dr. Zin. Data collection is, of course, followed by data analysis using SPSS. So, okay, going back to the polls here. So again, it looks like about, you know, 20 to 25% are familiar with the G-Power tutorials. We'll get you the links to those. It looks like we've already put the link in the chat area. That's awesome. And then the question on the right is, are you familiar with StatChat G-Power software? Or actually, probably just the question is, are you familiar with the G-Power software in general? Looks like that's roughly 50-50. About half the group is familiar and half of the group is not familiar. So, Dr. Zin, what is finally the step for our research study? What is the final step?
Well, Dr. Dunn, the final step of our research, of our diet soda research, is to conduct a posteriori achieved power analysis using the G-Power software that we've been speaking about.
Okay. So I'm looking here. We have. Okay, I think we opened the poll for are you still afraid of statistics? I think that'll be important to see. Aha. All right, you're going to be glad to see this, Dr. Zin, because we're now down to around less than 20% of our group are still afraid of statistics. So these are tremendous improvements, even literally from when we started the session some 20 minutes or so. So the next poll, are you familiar with statistical power analysis? And are you familiar with stratification of the data? So the first one is, yes, I'm familiar with statistical power analysis, and about 62-63% are familiar. About 42% are not familiar with power analysis. Looks like about 30% are familiar with the stratification of data, and about 50% are not familiar with stratification. And then finally, do you know that the Academic Skills Center tutors can help you with statistics? And of course, now you know, because you've been hearing us all day probably talk about this, over 90% of the audience is familiar that we can help you with this. That's awesome. So, Dr. Zin, please explain why this is an important step in the process.
Certainly, Dr. Dunn. This is important to calculate the achieved power after data collection to determine the strength of the study. As we know, researchers should collect far more raw data than the minimum a priori calculations, depending upon the stratification of the variables. And stratification of the variables is to take the whole sample and then separate it into smaller groups, say, for instance, by gender. That would be a stratification by gender, males and females. Or to stratify by age, where we may actually group them by between ages of 20 and 30 years to 30 and 40 years to 40 and 50 years and so forth. So depending upon the stratification of the variables, the posteriori achieved power will vary. As a data set is stratified, the sample size is reduced. For our diet soda research study, we may want to stratify the data set by gender so as to identify any gender-related differences to our research questions. And to reiterate, a researcher needs to be mindful that stratification reduces sample size and often reduces the strength or the power of the study.
Okay, so I'm going to take one last look at our polls. Looks like we've had a few more people vote. We're still around, we're about 25% are still afraid of statistics, 75% are not. That's awesome. Looks like a few more people are familiar with power analysis and stratification of the data, and still strong with understanding that the tutors can help you with your statistics. Those are some very important points you've shared with us, Dr. Zin. Do you want to give us the Walden University community a quick review before we go to the question and answer session?
Certainly, Dr. Dunn. I would be glad to. To recap, the 6-step doctoral research process for stats is 1. Determination of the research questions. 2. Operationalizing of the variables. 3. A determination of the appropriate test statistic to answer the research questions. 4. Sample size calculation using G-Power software. 5. The data collection process, whether a primary or secondary data collection process is chosen. Follow up with the statistical analysis using SPSS or another statistical software package. And 6, the posteriori analysis of achieved power.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zin, for that recap. That was awesome. You can ask us questions through the chat area. Yeah, I see Peter's campaigning for afraid of statistics. I think, like I said, I think a lot of people, I don't know if it's afraid, but I think a lot of people get stats anxiety. And I think, the more comfortable you get, some of these concepts, the more you have to, the more comfortable you're going to be, the easier it's going to be. I am by no means a statistician. I've, kind of learned, through trial and error, a lot of focus on the error part. That's really helped me to get more familiar with it. And I ended up getting through my doctoral dissertation. So, I know all of you can do it as well. Feel free to ask us questions about, where you are in your process.
Hey, Pat,
Yes,
there was some questions earlier about operationalizing the variables,
right.
and maybe if you could just talk a little bit about a better understanding of how to operationalize the variables for a study.
Yeah, Dr. Zin, maybe you can comment on that.
Certainly. When we look at operationalizing the variables, if we have separate by gender, males and females, then we'll want to code them as, say, males are 0 and females being number 1. That way, when we put them into the SPSS software, we'll be able to essentially crunch the numbers. It's important to remember how those numbers are actually labeled, because the way that the software will actually produce the results, the software shows a change in the output when you have an increase of the value of 1, which transfers to when you go from males to females, then the odds of the event happening or the phenomena happening will either increase or decrease. So that's one reason why we consider operationalizing of variables such as gender. When we also look at, say for instance, we're very all familiar with the Likert scale. When we look at level of pain, it always goes from 0 to no pain to 10 as being extremely painful. That scale from 0 to 10 is operationalizing of variables. The software does not recognize a little bit of pain versus moderate pain, so we need to be able to change those two numbers. Also, too, when we have different ethnicities, we look at categorizing the variables. So we may consider that we have African Americans coded as number 1, Asian Americans coded as number 2, Native Americans and Alaskans as number 3. Then we get into Caucasians and Pacific Islanders, all given different numerical values. That's also a form of operationalizing variables.
And I think it's important to distinguish variables that truly are measurement related. So the number associated actually has a measurement value compared to variables that are simply coded into categories. So for example, ethnicity, you might have it coded as 1 for Caucasian, 2 for Black, 3 for Hispanic, 4 for Asian. So those are simply codes. Those numbers don't have a measurement value. It's just how the software is using to distinguish those two numbers. But if it were a test of a measure like the BMI, the body mass index, then you might have an actual number that actually does represent a measure. So I think that's another way to kind of define and operationalize the values.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dr. Dunn.
We had another question again relating to like how and where do we even write up in our proposals the operationalization of the variables. And typically chapter 3 is the methods section. When you're doing your proposal, you're doing your first 3 chapters. So a lot of you're going to put a lot of time and effort in your proposal into the chapter 3, which is your methods.
Correct, Dr. Dunn. Chapter 3, materials and methods, is where the variables are operationalized or it's written in for the benefit of the reader. Also, in Chapter 3 is where the proposed analysis is included as well.
You know, it's really important too to really make sure all of those are aligned. So what you're talking about in your data collection and data analysis, that you can link back to, you know, your purpose, your research questions, and your hypothesis that you've generated. You know, the last thing you want to do is, you know, collect your data, analyze it, but it not actually be answering your research question.
Patrick, there also is a question here from a student that they have a study on associated factors to immunization coverage. So they're asking what type of test statistic would they use for an associated factors to immunization coverage?
So I might need a little bit more information, and Zin, you may actually know more about immunization than I do based on your background. When you say coverage, I'm not sure exactly what that means. Is that a dichotomous, I'm covered or I'm not covered? Is it a percentage of being covered, I'm 90% covered? Is the coverage based on a group? So, you know, 75% of the sample is covered? And Zin, maybe you know more than I do about this.
I think you make a good point, Dr. Dunn. If we're looking at the dependent variable immunization coverage, if we're looking at it as if my immunization shots are covered or I am going to be immunized, then we have a dichotomous dependent variable. So we lean towards a logistic analysis where we have different factors to determine whether or not we're going to get vaccinated. As you said, we could have different categories of immunization, more so than just yes or no. And in that case, we use a statistical analysis called discriminant analysis, which we have multiple factors, which are the independent variables or the determinants, and then we have different outcomes. I'm not sure how immunization coverage could be put on a scale that, you know, somebody is 40% covered,
Right.
60, 80%. I'm not sure, but it does, depending upon how the research question or what the student researcher wants to know, will determine what test statistic we're going to use.
Yeah, I mean, typically, ultimately, these things go back to, you know, the research question, the literature, the gaps in the literature. You know, that's really a lot for you to think about way before you start designing your statistical analysis. You want the stats to be supporting your research. You don't want the research question to be, you know, figured out after you've collected and analyzed your data. It kind of defeats the purpose of the whole probability testing in the first place. You actually create some bias when you do that.
So it's really important that, you know, students work with their committee chairs and committee members when designing the research study and conducting the research study.
Question about mixed methods as well. And again, when, you know, that's implying a combination of qualitative and quantitative. We can support the quantitative aspects. We tend not to, you know, we stay away from the qualitative. So again, it depends on the design you're using. If you're doing mixed methods research, again, really rely on support from your chair and especially the methodologist on your committee. And question about bivariate correlation. So again, that could mean a couple of things. Bivariate could mean two variables, two continuous variables where you're doing a simple correlation coefficient where you'd get an R value. I'm guessing that that's what that means. You know, there are some cases of, you know, trying to do, you know, a correlation or a regression using categorical values, but, you know, it's ideal if you're using continuous variables in those cases. If you get beyond two variables, you know, then you're into what's called multivariate. You could have a multiple correlation or a multivariate regression analysis. Again, it's always very important to keep clear which is the dependent and which is the independent variable. The dependent variable is the outcome that you're trying to achieve. So in Dr. Zin's example, the body mass is the outcome. The soda consumption would be the independent variable. It's easy to get those mixed and turned around, and sometimes that can lead you to the wrong analysis or the wrong conclusion. Yeah, so Borislav, typically a bivariate would mean 10 typically, well, two variables, and typically, but it doesn't have to be continuous. You could even have, you could use a 2x2 table in a chi-square and have two variables, but with a categorical or even a dichotomous variable. Dr. Zin, there's a question about in G-Power, if you're doing logistic regression, do you report the effect size as the odds ratio?
The effect size for logistic regression, for power analysis, we have the statistical test, the sample size, the level of power, precision, and we have the actual effect size, which is a value. Effect sizes were pretty much fathered by Dr. Jacob Cohen, and there are several different types of effect sizes reflecting different numbers. We see effect sizes of H and I and D and E based on the statistical testing. So when G-Power will actually give you a numerical value, in terms of the odds ratio, I believe I'd have to look at it more closely to see, because odds ratio and logistic regression are related, but in regards to the actual effect size, I'd have to take a look at that to be because I don't want to mislead anybody on that one.
So for the group, I just posted, it's called Code Word Chocolate. We've agreed, we have all of the support in the background that if we don't know the answer, we have people in the background that are looking this stuff up. But some of the stuff is actually pretty complicated. So, what you should probably do is actually set up an appointment with a tutor and actually put in the notes prior to the tutoring session, the question, so that the tutor has some time to actually do some research on it. Another question, is it applicable in logistic regression with regard to Cohen? So that it may have been related to what you just said. Okay, so another question, can you talk a little bit about BRL?
Is BLR bilinear regression, Christine?
Yes.
So it's the bivariate linear regression, just as you spoke about earlier, Dr. Dunn, where we have one independent variable and one dependent variable, both being continuous. And so when we do our calculation, we make a determination of essentially the best fit line for the relationship, which gives us our R value.
We have a question about how to determine your measurables. So that would be when we talked earlier about the broad versus the narrow. A lot of it is you have to go back, if you're doing a dissertation, hopefully it's something you're really interested in. You need to read about it and figure, see what other people have done, how they've measured it. If you're using a tool, make sure that, you have some validity and reliability in the tool itself. But a lot of those answers are not found in SPSS. They're found in the literature and how to apply that.
See, we have one here from Maria Tent asking about Cohen's effect size guidelines to power analysis using logistic regression. To address the Cohen's effect size, we have effect sizes are very similar to t-shirt sizes. They come in small, medium, and large. Depending upon what you want to know in your research question is how you determine the effect size to choose. Most often, a medium effect size works well for most research questions. However, a real-life example of a small effect size is the recommendation to consume baby aspirin daily. The consumption of baby aspirin, many probably are aware of this, but for every 10,000 people, it will actually save 3 from heart attack. That's a very, very small effect. The reason why it's actually recommended is because baby aspirin is relatively inexpensive and causes very little harm to people. And being that you're going to save 3 people out of 10,000, that doesn't seem like very much unless you're one of the 3. So that's an example of a very small effect size. So getting back to the research question, depending upon what you're actually looking for to see, is it going to be a very small difference, or if it's just a moderate difference, or if it's a very large difference that you're looking at, makes a determination in the sample size calculation. And that's where the G-Power helps you. As you A small effect size requires the largest sample size, whereas a large effect size requires the smallest sample size. I hope I'm being clear with that one.
And again, you know, some of these answers would require more in-depth, and that's, you know, when we get to the end, we'll talk about the contacting. We have roll accounts, we have tutoring, appointments, and we have these resources, including today's session, which will be on our website. There's a question Gabriel had about the function of the independent variable. So the independent variable is the intervention or the program or the process that you hope is affecting the dependent variable. So if I'm doing an exercise program to improve my fitness, the exercise program is the independent variable. My level of physical fitness is my dependent variable. So in whatever discipline and whatever type of thing, you typically have one dependent variable and then one or more independent variables. There was a question about predictor variables. So again, those predictor variables could be independent variables. Because it's in a plural state, that could imply a multiple factors, so like possibly a multiple regression, or even in some cases using like analysis of variance, where you're looking at multiple factors.
Just to continue on that point with the predictor variables, when choosing your predictor variables and your outcome variables, there has to be a logical relationship. If we look at educational attainment and annual income, for most communities or groups of people, we see that the higher the educational attainment, the higher the income. It would not be logical to reverse those and say just because someone has a high annual income, they must be highly educated. That doesn't actually have that much logic to it. However, if you reverse it with educational attainment being high and income being high, that has a much more logical sequence.
Linda had a question about, it was a hypothesis regarding teacher well-being. So it looks like it's teacher well-being and student well-being, and what are the statistical operations. So again, it goes back to how you would be measuring well-being in both the teachers and the students. Is that a scale, a score? Is it an ordinal value, low, moderate, and high? Those, how you measure it will determine the statistical approach that you'll take.
So Maria has a question. It says, so if G-power determines effect size, then you can apply Cohen's guidelines with respect to effect size. The effect size is going to be determined by the researcher based on published literature, because we're building our research on the work of others. So depending upon what the researcher, our student researcher, determines through a literature review will help them guide to the design of their study and the effect size to use for the calculation of sample size.
Leslie had a question about mediating variables. So again, this is a whole, beyond the few minutes that we have left, but you may have covariates, you may have confounders, you may have effect modifiers. So there's a lot of different types. So basically, if a third variable is affecting the relationship between the dependent and the independent variable, then you have to pursue those and look and see how it's affecting it. And there are some techniques for doing that, depending on the type of analysis that you're doing. That would be a good example for setting up an appointment.
That's a good point, Dr. Dunn. Some of the questions that we have require much more time and personal conversation for clarity. So the Academic Skills Center tutoring appointments, and I believe we have tutoring appointments available every week, Sunday through Saturday at various times with multiple tutors. So we try to reach out and make ourselves available to all the students at Walden.
So I want to thank everyone for joining us for our session today, and I hope you'll be able to join us for additional events.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Dunn, and for everyone else. It's been a really good session.
Yep, thank you.